All right, well, I will move us forward to our next speaker. So my name is Lisa. I work with Signature Health in the Family Planning Division, and I'm introducing Jessica Martin, who is the Senior Director of Programs and Behavioral Health from the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. They'll be talking on the trauma-informed services for BIPOC survivors. So Jessica, thank you for being here.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I always, when I start a morning presentation, like to point out that I no longer drink caffeine. So I do not wake up until at least noon every day, truly. So I'm just going to say ahead of time that if I talk ahead of myself or do something like that, I'm blaming it on the caffeine and not my inadequacies as a presenter. So I think we can all agree that that's fair. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It's great to be here. We are, and I believe you should be able to see that now. Yes, Liz, great. Thanks for the thumbs up. Okay, so we're going to be talking about trauma-informed services for BIPOC survivors. And what does BIPOC mean? It stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So we are going to be just talking through some points that we can utilize actually outside of the session in our own learning and in our agencies that can help us work with this population. The first thing I'm going to do really quickly is introduce myself, but the main point of my introduction is not even on this slide. When I discuss cultural humility and working with BIPOC survivors, I first like to mention that I am a white woman. I'm not speaking in this presentation from my own personal experiences of lived life. I could not do that. I do not know what it feels like to be a person of color. And I have never experienced those things. What I have done is worked with a lot of individuals from this population and also pulled and learned from my colleagues who are willing to share their experiences and their knowledge with me. And so throughout the years, I've developed kind of a repertoire of things that I find handy. I've pulled from my work experiences, but also the brains and knowledge of those around me as well. And so when talking about this, I just like to acknowledge that I am in a place of extreme privilege talking to you all about this. Just a couple of other things about me. I do have 11 years of experience working with trauma survivors. 8 years supervising trauma providers, including therapists, advocates, prevention and education staff, hotline workers. I did actually serve as a leader for Women Safe for 7 years, so they have a very big place in my heart, and I'm so happy to be here and support them in this amazing conference. So just wanted to give a shout out to Women Safe. Thank you so much. A lot of the information I'm sharing, I learned while working for Women Safe. So I would be remiss to not point that out. Today, I really want to cover a few specific objectives. The first is we're going to discuss cultural humility and the concept of ongoing learning for ourselves. We'll describe the impact of sexual trauma on survivors from diverse populations. So looking through the lens of, different types of populations and what sexual assault has meant for them over the years. And we will discuss interventions in and out of the session that help us to support these survivors. I'm going to take a sip of water. Hydration, it's so important. We were just talking about self-care, weren't we? So first off, cultural humility is really our new goal. Historically, we used to talk about cultural competency a lot. And that term kind of gives us a finality, like, oh, I have arrived, I'm done learning, I'm competent. I don't have to think about it anymore. And we really want to kind of get away from that because in reality, we know with any skill, we are always learning. The moment that we stop learning is the moment that we become complacent, is the moment that we start to make mistakes that we can't recover from. And so cultural humility changes that concept for us a little bit and gives us an ongoing process by which we respond respectfully to individuals from multiple identities and thinking about all of their intersectionalities. And and in a manner that recognizes and affirms the value and worth of that individual, their experience, their family, and their community, and preserves the dignity of each. So this is something we can't arrive at. This is an ongoing work that we're doing on ourselves, on our practice, on our profession, in our agencies as well. The goal of this is to eventually improve health outcomes for all of our BIPOC survivors and increase offender accountability through this process. So the first step in this is understanding cultural trauma. A lot of us may have attended, and I apologize if you didn't, there's not going to be a 101 section of this presentation, but a lot of us know the impacts that trauma can have on our brains and our bodies and ourselves, even as practitioners. One thing that we leave out a lot is cultural trauma. So cultural trauma occurs when members of a collective feel that they have been subjected to horrendous events that leave indelible marks on their group conscience, their DNA, as we'll talk about a little bit later. And this is the part where I said I would skip ahead on myself. But it marks their memories forever, changing the future identity and in fundamental ways that are irrevocable. Why should we discuss this? So sometimes I'll get questions of, slavery happened so long ago. Why is this still impacting Black survivors? One of the answers that I can give to that is epigenetics. So epigenetics is a study of heritable changes in our DNA, our gene expression, so active versus inactive genes. And it does not involve changes to our underlying sequence or anything like that. It's more the phenotype, which is what reads our DNA. And so through these activations, an individual can inherit certain aspects of trauma from generations before them. So regardless if someone has actively experienced a type of trauma or a type of cultural trauma in their life, in their lifetime, the marks of that cultural trauma are left on their DNA. And the understanding of history is not necessarily going to prepare us to create this great plan, but it does give us a starting place of where we can understand one another and work together towards something that is better. It's imperative for practitioners that are working with victims from special populations to understand what others have experienced as a collective, or they can't improve their interactions. So now we're going to go through a couple of different groups of survivors and talk about things that are very unique to their population. The first group we'll talk about are Native American survivors. And while there are approximately 17,000 rape crisis centers in the United States, there are less than 5 rape crisis programs that cater to sexual assault survivors of the Native community. And that count was last taken in the late 2010s. Poverty also increases a community's vulnerability for violence, and Native Americans continue to deal with an increased level of violence because of high rates of poverty. Violence against Native American communities has continued over the years through different forms. One example of this was in 1989, which was a while ago, thank goodness, but there was a video game released called Custer's Revenge, in which players got additional points for raping Native Americans in the game. So a couple of facts to share with you about the Native American population is that 34.1% of women report rape in their lifetime. This statistic is incredibly high compared to other populations. 90% of Native American women in chemical dependency treatment are victims of rape and childhood sexual abuse. About 9 in 10 victims of rape or sexual assault were estimated to have had assailants who were non-Native American. So something that's very unique to this population is that they are being raped by individuals that do not look like them. Whereas other populations typically individuals are being raped by people of the same culture. So that's very unique for this population. And also there's a much higher, or a much lower rate of prosecution in these cases. Between 2005 and 2009, the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to prosecute 67% of sexual abuse cases by non-Native perpetrator with a Native victim. The next group that we'll discuss is the Hispanic or Latinx community. The first thing to think about is that in this culture, women may be criticized and men highly criticized for turning to sources other than the church or their family for help. Within this culture, there is a lot of secrecy because of protection, because of fear. Especially in the United States, there's fear of ICE and deportation for our undocumented survivors, which can cause them to remain silent when facing domestic violence or sexual assault. Approximately 7.9% of Latinas will be raped by a spouse, boyfriend, or ex-boyfriend during their lifetime. And this is an incredibly high statistic when compared to other populations. In addition to that, married women from this community are also less likely to immediately define their experience of forced sex as rape in a relationship. So there is this idea that has been passed down through generations that when a man wants it, he gets it, and it doesn't matter, and that is your duty. When in reality, we know now that this is rape. It's taken the laws a long time to catch up with us, and there are some states in the US where it is still considered technically legal to rape your spouse. Asian and Pacific Islander survivors, we also find that they have a much higher rate of rape in their lifetime, 6.8%. And they report lower rates of rape than other forms of sexual violence and domestic violence than do women and men from other minority backgrounds. With traditional Asian families, there may be value placed on suffering without complaint. Additionally, there may be pressure to keep the information about the assault within the family and not to seek outside resources. This is due to things like shame, public humiliation. Asian women are stereotyped as well as being docile and are seen as easy targets for sexual violence. They're also fetishized. Words are hard today. Maybe I should have had a little caffeine before this one. I'm not sure. Such stereotypes possibly prompt people to blame Asian women for not sticking up for themselves. Their violence is often understood as a result of their perceived submissive or passive attitudes. The next population that we'll discuss are African American and Black survivors. For every Black woman that reports, at least 15 do not. 60% of African American or Black survivors will experience sexual abuse by the age of 18. African American women may feel pressure to fit the stereotype of being strong, and this in turn can lead to denial of their own vulnerability or a desire to hide their vulnerability from others. Because most sexual assaults involve a victim and perpetrator of the same race, there may be either internal or external pressure on a survivor to keep quiet about an assault in order to avoid further negative stereotypes about the men of that race. And so what we find are in cultures where there is a lot of oppression and a lot of negative public opinion, survivors may hide to continue protecting their race and their community as well. Of course, being a Black survivor in the United States, one has a history in their DNA of slavery. There were reproduction plantations, rape of enslaved women and men. Interracial rape was encouraged. Also, gang rapes were used as a form of punishment for Black survivors. This was also true for Black men and children. They were therefore reduced to being viewed, treated, and consumed as property and not as human beings. There were even laws developed in Congress that talked about how Black survivors or Black individuals were not deemed to be human. They were deemed to be property. They were able to be owned, and therefore their rights did not matter. Some other issues that pop up with this population is that Black girls are treated and seen as older than white girls of the same age, that they need less nurturing than white girls, less protection because they're stronger is the stereotype that in labels that are often placed on them, that they need to be supported less, comforted less, they're more independent. They know more about adult topics than white girls. And these are things that, this is a study actually, that applied analysis to a survey of 325 adults from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds and educational levels across the US. Across the 4 age brackets examined, the most significant differences in adult perceptions were found in relation to girls in mid-childhood, ages 5 to 9, and early adolescence, ages 10 to 14, continuing to a lesser degree in the following ages. No statistical differences were found in the ages of 0 to 4, which is good, but the biases revealed this in this study shed new light on why Black girls are consistently disciplined more harshly, why educators, school-based police officers, and officials across the juvenile justice system often have significant discretion in their decision-making, including, and that's why that's concerning, is that if we have these biases, and these are the biases that this study uncovered, and we're in charge of making those decisions, that's a lot of responsibility. And are we really thinking through that responsibility? Are we challenging our biases in a way that will help us to do our work better, to do it in a more equitable manner? As a lot of us know now, one of the historical implications of historical trauma is the backlog of untested rape kits. And so Detroit, Memphis, even Cleveland, high levels of the untested rape kits were found to be from Black women, victims of color, often from lower class neighborhoods or neighborhoods of poverty. Historical experiences with systems have prevented many sexual assault victims of color from feeling safe or coming forward to report assaults. The backlog of untested rape kits was a further validation to that fear for this community, that when they come out, when they do try to press charges and do the right thing, file the reports, they will not, the fear is that they will not be believed, their cases will not be taken seriously, or they will just sit on a shelf and be ignored. The Department of Justice in Baltimore found that detectives failed to develop and resolve preliminary investigations. They failed to identify and collect evidence to corroborate victims' accounts, inadequately documented their investigative steps, failed to collect and assess data and report and classify reports of sexual assault, and they all lacked supervisory review as well. We also have concerns, is what they said, that officers' interactions with women victims of sexual assault and with the transgender community display unlawful gender bias. And so without doing this continued learning, without really diving deep into ourselves and doing the work on a consistent basis, large biases can take effect. And it's not one individual, it's not one bad person that is doing this. It's just kind of a situation of not being aware in some cases as well. that if we ignore these things, that some undercurrents can take over without us even realizing it. And so how do we respond? When we have survivors from different populations coming into our office looking for advocacy, when we're going out and presenting prevention education to the community, what are some things that we can do to help ourselves improve in this area? So when responding to Native American survivors, we should take into consideration that a sexual assault against an individual is also seen as an assault against the community. We have to recognize how power dynamics will impact reporting and engagement due to colonization. Child sex abuse victims are often re-victimized as adults, so understanding that when a Native American survivor presents for services, this may not be the first time. And they may have a lot of historical trauma to work through on that. Also understanding that each reservation and tribe are unique in their history, values, and culture. The injustices experienced by the Native American community has created a perception among Native American women that violence against them is both acceptable and sanctioned by the state. Moreover, in contributing to the decay of Native American women's self-esteem and feelings of self-worth, this affects not only the individual survivor of sexual assault, but also the entire community as they struggle to deal with the state's continuous marginalization of their civil rights. As professionals, we have to understand when trying to respond to survivors from this community in a trauma-informed manner, some key considerations are that, we want to understand that their experience, their history is much different, that their support has been much different through the years, and they may not expect or trust much from us at first. It may take a lot longer to build trust with this community when they're presenting for services. And sometimes we have to be willing to walk with them until they're ready. Key considerations when responding to Hispanic or Latinx survivors are first identifying if there are language barriers. We don't want to assume, and I do see this happen all the time in social services, even occasionally within our own agency if we have a new provider. We don't want to assume that the person speaks Spanish. We also don't want to assume what type of Spanish they're speaking. There are many different dialects. There are also many different languages that sound similar to Spanish, like Portuguese. So we first want to make sure that we're identifying the correct language when we're engaging with this population. We don't want to use family, friends, or children to translate, as the survivor may need to share very humiliating, embarrassing information that they would not disclose. If a survivor had an injury to a personal area and they needed medical attention, this is not something they may tell their child to tell you in an emergency. And so we want to make sure that we have trained trauma-informed interpreters, that we work with companies that provide these things. Like I know Local Lingua is a really great one that I've worked with quite a bit in the past, and they vet their interpreters ahead of time and make sure that they have trauma-informed training so that they're able to provide good services when they come. We also want to be mindful of any immigration issues. Understand that survivors may not want to report because they're undocumented, because their offender is utilizing power and control over them because of their immigration status. I've seen in the field even survivors who have their U.S. citizens, and they're not aware of it because their abuser has kept all of that stuff hidden from them, all of those documents. And so while they had the rights of an American citizen, they were operating under the idea that they had none. We want to make sure that we're explaining the process of treatment, investigation, confidentiality very thoroughly in a way that everyone can understand. We want to check for understanding on a regular basis because of that lack of trust that an individual may have in the relationship. And as I mentioned before with the previous populations, we want to take time and allow for that trust to build. Understanding that they typically do not seek assistance outside of the family or church, and honoring that you were chosen as an individual to assist them. Some considerations when responding to Asian or Pacific Islander survivors is that they are the least likely to report assault for reasons of language, culture, and mistrust of law enforcement. Understanding how shame and honor will impact the investigation, their family, their career, and their community. Understand that there is a risk of social isolation or rejection for the survivor. That there are hierarchical structures within the community and family that may prevent or put barriers on the treatment. We also want to identify language barriers. Once again, not using friends or family, but also understanding that just because someone can speak English doesn't mean that it's appropriate to conduct the sessions or the services in English with that survivor, and really asking, would they feel more comfortable engaging in services in their own native language? Key considerations when working with African American and Black survivors are that we want to understand the culture of silence, and that recantation does not often equal that it didn't happen. That many survivors may come forward, and after realizing the negative consequences of that choice, they may take back what they said in the hopes of making it go away because it's become way too difficult to deal with. We also want to understand the mistrust of systems. So there's an importance of building relationships intentionally over time, creating systems that are supportive to Black survivors, recognizing the complexities of experiencing sexual trauma, admit the trauma of racial disparity, civil unrest, police brutality, all of these things that are going on are adding to that traumatic experience for that survivor. And so when they come in, their trauma has many layers. There's a lot of things happening. And while our main goal in therapy may be to focus on domestic violence, trauma, or sexual assault, there may be many other things that that survivor needs as well. And we want to avoid stereotyping or assuming that we know about a person's upbringing, cultural identity, or family experience just based on the color of their skin. Another thing that we do is that we see Black survivors and assume that they have all had the same experiences. You know, some survivors grow up in different neighborhoods far away from the influences of their culture. And so what does it look like for them? So how might a survivor's cultural identity impact their treatment after sexual violence or domestic violence? We want to understand that there may be a lot of fear of the criminal justice system, a lot of self-blame, and fear of not being believed. The untested rape kits show this to be a real fear for survivors. That was all over the news. A lot of people know about it. And so, you know, that's something that is weighing heavily on people's minds when they're thinking about coming forward. We want to take a look at internalized depression. We want to look at intersectionality, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. We want to think about generational patterns of abuse. You know, we often talk about this in domestic violence, that there are generational patterns of domestic violence, but that also applies to sexual assault. That also applies to many other forms of abuse that can occur. We want to make sure that our programs and systems have diversity within them. Right now, we are lacking diversity. So are we being mindful about starting programs that are geared toward recruiting people from different communities to do this work, so that when a survivor shows up at an agency, they see different types of faces? One thing that lit up my heart so big when I first started at CRCC is I was showing up to work one day, and we had a young a young Black male survivor that was, I think he was maybe 4 or 5, that was waiting in the waiting room for his first appointment with our therapist, Maya. And she is a Black therapist. And when she walked out, he was like, "Mommy, she looks like me." That's what he's, and I was like, oh, like just that, just seeing someone that looks like them lets them know that, this might be a safe place. People might understand me here. It was very, very important. And I was just, wow, the impact of that one sentence was so profound for me. "Mommy, she looks like me." And Maya, of course, her face just lit up too, because, and I talked to her about this later, she mentioned that she hears that a lot. And for her, a part of her job that is so important is to show children that there are Black people that are professionals, and there are Black people that can do good work and can do good things. And she loves to be a part of that. So when thinking about trauma as a whole, sometimes we'll refer to ACEs. We know that the original ACE study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente in the late 90s. It was primarily focused on white, middle-class, affluent, college-educated individuals, and it did leave out a lot of racial trauma stuff. So we know that our ACE checklist is not complete, that we are missing many different areas, but in particular, for the purposes of this conversation, today we're missing that racial trauma part. And so thinking about that when we're looking at our clients holistically and thinking about, what behaviors does this make them more likely to experience? What health issues are more likely to occur because of this level of trauma? And also noting that their ACE score may be a lot higher than what we think it is, because we're not asking the right questions and we're not assessing for the right stuff. And then thinking about how trauma impacts the brain. And if we think about this just in the context of cultural trauma, think about when a survivor presents for services. Are there any reminders of past trauma in that service? Is there a barrier maybe they might face that will trigger them into thinking that, here we go again, I can't trust these people? That's something that we see a lot. The most common form of complaint that I have experienced from individuals from different cultures is barriers to services. People do not feel heard. They don't feel supported. And that's sometimes when they speak up. But as we know, and as I mentioned, a lot of folks from these populations do not feel they can. So what feedback are we missing when we think about that? When we send out our client surveys to get that feedback from our survivors, who isn't speaking up? And that there may be many reasons for that. And so thinking about, are there reminders of past trauma? Are there barriers to services that when someone is trying to come in, trying to get to know us, to learn if they can trust us, that may activate that alarm system in their bodies? Is there a way that we may be re-traumatizing? And so going back to cultural humility and responsiveness, the first thing that we want to do is consider intersectionality. All the different pieces and parts that make up an individual. Intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it is a lens through which you can see where the power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem there, a class or LGBTQ problem here. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. And so I was putting people throughout this conversation in a bubble when I was talking about Black and African American survivors here, Native American survivors here. And to talk about it, we will separate out individual identities so that we can dive more into them. But we have to remember that that is not the only identity an individual is showing up with. So what if your survivor is a Black male who comes from a very, very poor background and neighborhood, is currently living in poverty, and they are gay? all of these identities and all of this, that's also a lot of different types of trauma, a lot of different types of oppression that someone's dealing with on top of being a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault. And so are we really truly digging out all the different pieces of our client and looking at them as a whole when we're creating a treatment plan, when we're doing an assessment, when we're creating an education plan to go into a school that is primarily people of color? So what are some ways that we can address equity and inclusion outside of the session? Well, one of the first is to develop equity primes for your agencies. Equity primes are questions that we can ask ourselves to get the conversation going. And I gave some examples here. We have many, many more. Equity primes belong in every aspect of our communications in this work. So interpersonal or individual, asking, how is my decision or action empowering or isolating others that are often marginalized? How are my biases or my privilege impacting the way I'm listening and acting? Sometimes when I ask myself this question in particular, I find that I'm shutting out information because of my own experience. And we do that, actually, we have to do that in some of our work, right? Because as we get experience in this field, we're able to pull from past things we've done to improve the situation or solve it faster. But sometimes we get too sure of ourselves and we start to shut out the information that can be helpful to us as well. Interpersonal, what nonverbal cues are helping or hindering our communication? If you talk to a client, a person of color, and it doesn't go well, do you sit and reflect on that? Like, was there anything that I did that may have put that barrier there, whether it's verbal or nonverbal? Was it something in the agency or the way that we conduct our business that maybe put a wedge in the conversation before it even began? Are we utilizing one another's different perspectives in our conversation? What is the real and perceived power dynamic in this interaction? So we know that clients coming in for services, clients coming in to file a report, we are in a position of power over them already, right? We hold the key to, if someone listens, we hold the key to potential prosecution or court case or potential shelter or counseling. And we also have the ability potentially or perceived by that individual to take all of that away. And that's without even thinking about race or culture, because those add other power dynamics to the mix, right? So like we think about intersectionality for someone's identity, we should also think about intersectionality of power dynamic. How many layers of power dynamic are there in this conversation that I'm having? Culturally, am I in a position of power over someone just based on the color of my skin and my life experience? And in a lot of situations, for me as a white woman, the answer to that is yes. And so am I honoring that power dynamic as well? Group or institutional, so as an agency, are we aware of the hierarchies and power dynamics? And how has this impacted our growth? And I mean within the agency, hierarchies and power dynamics. How can we use data to identify who's not represented, both internally and externally? So are we looking at the percentage of populations we serve and trying to get our workforce to match more closely with those percentages, or at least using that as a goal? If we're serving 50% of our clients are African-American, is 50% of our staff African-American? Is there a way, and if not, is there a way that we can just try to recruit people from different cultures so that when survivors walk in, they see someone who looks like them maybe? In interviews, we ask a lot of questions at CRCC about equity and inclusion in interviews. And I feel like, I told my boss, I feel like I'm creating new questions every day. Just yesterday, I asked a potential therapist if they could talk to me about the white savior complex. And I was so happy that she knew how to answer that question. But I was like, ooh, we got to jot that one down. Because even as providers that are trying to do this work, we can start to act like it's our own platform or our own voice, but really I'm an echo. We should be echoes. We should help to support the platform, not try to build it ourselves. But I digress. In interviewing, one of the questions we ask is, can you tell us about your experience working with and serving people different from yourself? And this could be any type of culture. You know, in Geauga County, we have a high Amish population. Do you have experience working with them? So thinking about those things, what experiences do you have and what has worked in the past? Outside of individual conversations and agency-wide conversations that we can have, there are other things that we can do as a group to continue our learning. So developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion council or a social justice committee at work can be really great. Hosting crucial conversations. So opening up a conversation and dialogue with staff when a large event happens in a cultural community and talking through and processing that. You know, I think this year alone presented us with many, many options on hosting conversations about current events that are happening around the US. Team book clubs have been extremely successful, and you can do these as an agency where everyone's coming together, or you can break it down into teams and read books that may be more impactful to their work and really teasing out these ideas and themes. Right now, our group is reading, what is it called? It'll come to me. Between the World and Me, which we haven't started reading it yet. We're about to, by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And it's more of a letter from a Black man to his son is what I've heard. But it's a really highly educational and helpful book. And so the team is now reading that and is going to use that information just to help ourselves grow a little bit this year. And looking at continued education resources. So hosting trainings for the staff for implicit bias, looking to hire diverse staff, or at least being intentional about ways that you recruit and where you recruit. Reviewing policies to see how they might impact survivors or staff of color. Like, for instance, do you at your agency have a policy for handling micro and macro aggressions against staff and clients? This is something that a lot of agencies don't yet have. And you know, that's something that maybe a diversity, equity, and inclusion council could handle. And so this, you know, these things can kind of tie together. If you have a group of individuals at your agency that are focused on this work, they can really go through policies and procedures and techniques that the agency utilizes and look at them through a different lens. What are some ways that we can eliminate barriers? So understanding intersectionality of victimization is incredibly important, but also identifying community leaders. Oh, there's a tiny fly. It always happens during presentations. So, you know, community leaders, for instance, in the Amish community, connecting with bishops of the church can be incredibly powerful in connecting with survivors in that community. Identify organizations that already have a trusting relationship with different populations and build a relationship with them. See how they're doing the work and how is it different. Also utilizing them as a referral source when they may be more appropriate for the survivor than your services are. Hosting community events to bring awareness across all communities can be helpful. Looking at your marketing material, making sure that it's diverse, both in print and electronic, and reflective of the individuals that you're serving. Making sure that when people come into the office, they see things that resemble their culture. Accept that some cultures may have or use non-traditional support systems, and their process of recovery may look different from our own, and respecting that. And practice being comfortable asking assessment questions and talking with your clients and colleagues about culture, race, religion, gender, and cultural trauma. It's not easy. I've only done this presentation twice, and I can tell you the first time I did it, I was incredibly nervous as a white woman talking about BIPOC survivors. It's okay to talk about the fact that we're a little nervous, but we need to push through that. We can't utilize that nervousness to remain silent and complacent, right? We want to continue our learning. And so practice it, and practice being okay with being a little nervous and being a little uncomfortable when you have conversations. We're not good at it yet. It takes practice to become good at something, right? Forgive yourselves. Be human. It's okay. And some additional tips is just explain the process and limitations of your role when you're meeting someone. Are you comfortable talking to a survivor about their culture and if they would rather work with someone that looks like them, or if they're okay working with someone who doesn't look like them and what that might mean? Are they worried that you might not be able to understand certain aspects of their trauma because of the color of your skin or because of your background? Talk about that. Give clients permission to speak up if they're not sure of something or if they would prefer something to be done in a different way. If survivors disengage from services, leave the door open for them to come back. Let them know that we're still here. It's okay. They don't have to continue doing anything they don't want to, and you'll be here whenever they need help again. And just understanding that one of the key principles of trauma-informed care is cultural, historical, and gender issues. But when you look at all of these key principles, really, cultural trauma and cultural humility can fit in all of these things. When we look at safety, do certain populations feel safer than others? And what can we do to increase that feeling of safety for other populations? Is there enough trustworthiness and transparency in our services for all cultures that are interacting with us? Peer support. Are we providing enough options for peer support for individuals to choose someone from their culture if they can? Collaboration. Are we seeking out providers in the area that are experts in this? Are we looking at cultural institutions that survivors lean on for support already and building those relationships and learning from them? Looking at empowerment, voice and choice. Some cultures may be more empowered than others. Some may be used to using their voice and some may hide their voice. And so understanding those things. So really, when we look at SAMHSA's key principles, while one block specifically states cultural, historical, and gender issues, all of them are impacted by cultural trauma. And I just want to say I'm a little impressed with myself because I believe it is 10:49. I could not have planned that better. And so that is the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions? Are there any questions in the chat?
Hi, Jessica, that was great. And I think it really actually intertwined with the previous one pretty well. So that order worked out with some of the trauma-informed stuff that you built in. The only question that I saw so far, which you sort of touched on, so I don't know if maybe you saw it or you just got it through the ether.
Oh, no, I didn't see it.
When you were going through the different identities in the beginning with the stats, someone had asked if you had any information on the Amish community.
Yes, I do, and I did not include that in this because they're not technically considered BIPOC survivors, because they are primarily present as white survivors. However, yes, there are. So when talking about Amish survivors, I would say a couple of things to note is that they often rely on family or church for support before relying on any external providers or agencies. There's a huge fear when Amish survivors report of being excommunicated or eliminated from the community or shunned. And this is something that we see happen on a regular basis. If an individual goes into shelter, their families and their friends and everybody they knew stopped talking to them. And so, just keeping in mind what an Amish survivor is risking giving up just by coming forward and understanding the level of fear and the level of apprehension that may go with that. That's my, in a nutshell, answer to that question. Although I could do a whole presentation on the Amish community alone.
Great, thank you for that. And then someone also asked, what was the name of the letter from dad to son that you're studying?
Yes, Between the World and Me.
Between the World and Me.
Mm-hmm.
All right, anything else? Feel free to speak up now. While we're waiting, if any other questions come in, the code for this session is survivors. So if you are planning to get CEUs and doing the evaluations later, you will need the session code, and I will put it in the chat as well. And nothing else is coming up that I can see. So we will say thank you very much to Jessica, and that was a great presentation.
Thank you all. Have a lovely day.